Shabbat Shalom. Today's message is called Playing with Fire, and it's based on Parsha Shemini from Leviticus chapter 10. I'm sure many of you have heard the old adage that goes, if you play with fire, you're going to get burned. Now, Nadab and Abihu were destroyed by God because they offered an unauthorized fire before God. And what they had done wrong, and what can we learn from their mistake? Every year someone hands out something called the Darwin Awards, which are bestowed to honor the least evolved among us. And previous news stories that have received their attention have included the following. A chef at a hotel in Switzerland lost a finger in a meat cutting machine. Shortly afterward, he submitted a claim to his insurance company. And the company, suspecting negligence, sent out one of its men to have a look for himself, and he tried the machine, and he also lost a finger, and the chef's claim was approved. One moment, let me just check this here somehow. I want to make sure this is, it won't let me turn it. I hope this video is on public and not private, but I have no way of connecting that right now. One Arkansas man was he wanted some beer. And so he decided to throw a cinder block through a liquor store window to grab some booze and then run for it. What he didn't realize was that the window was made of heavy-duty plexiglass. And when he lifted the cinder block and heaved it over his head at the window, it bounced back and hit him in the head, knocking him unconscious. And the whole event was caught on videotape. But one of the most memorable Darwin Awards honored a man from Provo, Utah, a robber who pulled his .38 caliber revolver on his victim and pulled the trigger, but it failed to fire. And so he peered down the barrel and tried the trigger again, and this time it worked. Sometimes people will do, the most foolish of things. And, when they do these foolish things, there's often a price that has to be paid. Sometimes that price is embarrassment, and sometimes it's pain, and sometimes the price can even be death. And the story in our Parsha today, Shemini in Leviticus 10, tells us about two young men who did a very foolish thing and paid the ultimate price, and their names were Nadab and Abihu. Now, Nadab and Abihu were nephews of Moses and the two eldest sons of Moses' brother, Aaron, the high priest of Israel. And they were born in Egypt, and by the time we read this story in Leviticus, they were possibly around 20 to 30 years old. And they had been groomed for leadership ever since they had come to the mountain of God. And when Moses was about to go up to the mountain to receive the Torah, or the Ten Commandments, God says, in Exodus 24, verses 1 and 2, he says, "Come up to Adonai, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone is to approach Adonai, but the others may not draw near, nor are the people to go with them." Later, God told Moses in Exodus 28, "Bring your brother Aaron near with his sons from among the children of Israel, so that they may minister to me as Kohanim," that is, priests. Aaron and his sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. Now, these two sons of Aaron were to be some of the most prominent leaders in Israel. They were going to be entrusted with the holy items in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and they were the ones who would offer up sacrifices on behalf of the people. And they became priests of the Most High God, and they stood before the people as God's most sacred servants. Let's think about that, let that sink in. But something went very wrong, and they died. What happened? Well, as we ponder what happened, Leviticus 10, 1 and 2 tells us, Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his own censer, put fire in it, laid incense over it, and offered unauthorized fire before Adonai. They offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire came out from the presence of Adonai and consumed them, and so they died before Adonai. And that's all we're told. Nadab and Abihu offered an unauthorized fire before God, and God killed them. Not only did God destroy them, verse 6 tells us, Then Moses told Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, Don't unbind your hair or tear your clothes in mourning, so that you won't die, and so that Adonai won't be angry with the entire community. Rather, let your kinsmen, the whole house of Israel, mourn because of the destruction Adonai brought about with his fire. Again, what happened? Why was God so angry with Nadab and Abihu? And why were Aaron and his remaining sons warned not to mourn their deaths? Everything in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and all of its activities were specifically designed by God. Hebrews 8 verse 5 tells us that the sanctuary was a replica and foreshadow of the heavenlies, one that is just as Moses was instructed by God when he was about to complete the tabernacle, for he says, See that you make everything according to the design that was shown to you on the mountain. Everything in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was designed to tell us about God's plan for our lives and leading us to him and Shemayim, which is heaven. And for example, the incense was always to be for a specific formula compounded from precious materials, including a very special ingredient called levonah in Hebrew. Levonah. That's translated as frankincense. And that's from, you can see that in Exodus 30, verse 34. Levonah, frankincense. Consider this ingredient, levonah, frankincense. For thousands of years, this costly resin has been one of Somalia's big exports. A few gnarled but prized trees managed to grow in the harsh mountainous areas along the Horn of Africa's tip. And wherever the tree is cut or broken, or where insects have eaten through the bark, layers of thick resin, frankincense, seep out from the heart of the tree to heal the wound. Right? It seeps out to heal the wound at the tree. Many people have also associated levonah or frankincense with the birth of Yeshua. It was one of the gifts the Magi had given to him. 33 years later, Yeshua would be wounded and broken on a tree, offered up so that we might be healed from the sin that destroys our lives. And just like levonah, frankincense, he was a priceless gift that came from the heart. But apparently Nadab and Abihu were not guilty of messing with the formula of the incense. They had offered up an unauthorized fire. Some translations use strange fire. But the original Hebrew uses a word for this called zara. Zara. The same word that the Bible uses to describe a prostitute, a harlot. Nadab and Abihu had prostituted something precious in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, before the Lord, before Adonai. What was it they did wrong? Remember, everything that they did in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, spoke of God's plan for mankind, and it spoke of the ultimate sacrifice God was going to pay to redeem us from sin. Let me give an example. Imagine, in your mind's eye, Imagine your congregational sanctuary as being the courtyard of the tabernacle. Instead of walls, there is an 8-foot-high fence of fabric that encloses the tabernacle and its activities, and there would be an altar of sacrifice where you would bring your sacrifice and present it before the Lord. A certain portion of your sacrifice would be totally consumed by the fires of the altar, but that's not the only purpose that fire served. This fire at the altar of sacrifice was what Nadab and Abihu were supposed to use in their censers as they prepared to enter the tabernacle and place their incense on the altar of incense before the holy place, which was near the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. No other source of fire was acceptable. Why? Because man could not come into God's presence without sacrifice. Something had to die for man to be able to come into God's presence. Nadab and Abihu knew this. They knew it well. They had been instructed. They had been trained in all their responsibilities and duties. They had been warned of the dangers of changing anything that God required, especially in the tent of meeting. But they disobeyed for some reason. They brought Esh Zarah, a Zarah fire, a strange, unauthorized, a prostituted fire into the presence of God. What God had required didn't strike them as important enough. What God had required wasn't convenient for them at the time. And so they bypassed the altar of sacrifice and substituted with some other source of fire. So what do we learn from this? First, we learn that a priest of God is held responsible for how they handle the holy things of God. After Nadab and Abihu's death, God told Moses this in Leviticus 10, verse 3. He says, "To those who are near me, I will show myself holy in the sight of all the people. I will be honored." When we became believers and followers of Messiah, we became priests. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. As priests, we are expected by God to honor him and to respect the things he regards as holy. But what are the things that God regards? What are the things that God regards as holy? Well, we have God's book. We have God's book. We have God's book, the Holy Bible. And in it, in Deuteronomy 4, verse 2, it tells us something interesting. It says, "You must not add to the word that I am commanding you, or take away from it, in order to keep the mitzvot," that is the commandments, "of Adonai your God that I am commanding you." Now, I'm sure there are those who would say, well, but that command only applies to Deuteronomy. So you could turn then to Revelation 22, verse 18, where God says, "I warn anyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds anything to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book." Again, there are those who would say, well, of course that applies to Revelation, but not the rest. And then you can ask them to consider Proverbs chapter 30, verse 6. "Do not add to his words, or he will rebuke you and prove you a liar." Where am I going with this? You see, there are liars out there in the world who would try to convince us that God's word is not the final authority in our faith. The Bible says one thing, they describe it in some other way. There are those that'll say, the Messiah put an end to the law. Really? So why does it say in Matthew chapter 5 that he specifically did not come to abolish the Torah or the prophets? They put their own spin on it. It's within the pages of God's book, the Bible, that we learn all we know about God and his plan for our life and our hope eternal through Yeshua the Messiah. Every page tells us more and more about what we need to know as priests of the Most High God. But there are liars out there who handle the book as if it were theirs to manipulate. But here's the deal. They don't own the book. Who owns the book? God owns the book. There is no congregation, no organization, no denomination that owns his book. There is no rabbi, pastor, preacher who owns his book. I don't own his book, and you don't own his book. It's God's holy Bible, and if we mistreat it, we will face God's judgment. So first, we must learn that a priest of God, and that's us, by the way, that's you, are held responsible for how we treat the holy things of God. As priests of God, God expects us to respectfully handle the things and people that he regards as holy. Secondly, we learn that God will not accept substitutes. Down through the ages, supposed men of God had substituted unauthorized things into God's people, believing they could improve on what God has already established. Doing things God's way didn't work for them, so they brought unauthorized practices into God's community. They brought a strange fire into the doctrines of God's people, and they caused a lot of division in Messiah's community because they thought they had a better or more convenient idea or spin on how the faith should be, how it should be experienced, how it should be expressed. And down through the ages, men have tried to improve on the things of God. They've sought more convenient ways to obey what God has asked. One moment. But ultimately, the question comes down to obedience. We will do what we do because God asked. Will we? Will we do what we do because God has asked us? Or will we do only what we feel is right? This coming Tuesday, April 21st, Nisan 27, is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that is in Israel and for the Jewish people worldwide. And I realize there's another Holocaust Day, I think it's in January, which was set up by some other international groups. But the original one, the one that Israel had instituted, comes on Nisan 27, the Hebrew calendar. So therefore, on the Western calendar, this date moves around from year to year. This year, it is on Tuesday, April 21st, 3 days from now. That's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, the word Holocaust is from a Greek word meaning death by fire or burning. The Nazi Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and also as many as 6 million other people, was the worst calamity. It was the worst calamity in Jewish history. And it's been now 75 years since the defeat of Hitler's Nazi Germany by the American and Allied forces in May of 1945. I will share with you a true Holocaust story that you may have heard before or not, that inspired me with the hope that it will inspire you as well. And this story is based on a book called The Flag with 56 Stars by Susan Rubin. And let me share the central story of the book with you. The story took place in Mauthausen. It occurred right near the end of the war. Mauthausen was one of the worst of the concentration camps. People were burned, shot, and worked to death there. And finally, the end of the war drew near. The guards knew that the American army would arrive momentarily, and so they ran away during the night. When the people who were imprisoned in Mauthausen woke up the next morning, they found out that they were free. What should they do with this freedom? What should they do now that they are free? Some said, let us seize weapons and go after the guards who have tortured us for so long, and let's kill them. And that must have been a tempting thought. Could anyone have blamed them if they had done that? But they didn't know where the guards had gone, and they had no weapons, and they did not have the strength to go after them, and so they didn't do that. And some said, let us break into the kitchen and gorge ourselves on the food that the Nazis have left behind. And that must have been a tempting thought too. But most of them were wise enough to realize that they could not fill their emaciated stomachs with too much food, and that if they did, they would become very ill. And so most of them did not do that. And someone came up with an idea. The Americans are on the way. They will be here soon. They are bringing freedom and a future for us. Let's greet them and let's show them how glad we are that they have come. And that idea was accepted. They decided they would stand at the gates of Mauthausen, and when the American tanks came into sight, they would cheer with whatever strength they still possessed, and they would wave flags. The only problem was that nowhere in the concentration camp could they find any flags except the Nazi flag, where could they find an American flag in Mauthausen? And they searched the camp and found some discarded swaths and scraps of cloth, a white one here, a red one there, a blue one here. And there were a few tailors in the camp, people who had been kept alive because of their ability to sew Nazi uniforms. And these tailors set to work to make an American flag. Betsy Ross herself did not work with as much fervor and as much determination as these tailors did that night. And they worked all night, and by dawn they put together an American flag. And it would be a way of greeting and thanking the American soldiers who were on the way. And there was only one problem. These Jews who came from Poland and Lithuania and Austria and other such places knew how to sew, but they had no idea how many stripes and how many stars there were in the American flag. There was no library to consult in Mauthausen, and so they did what Jews always do when they are not sure what the right answer to a question is. They argued. One said, I was once in America, and I remember the Stars and Stripes had 13 stripes and 13 stars in honor of the 13 original states. And another said, I remember reading a book, the Stars and Stripes has 56 stars in honor of the 56 states. And they argued back and forth, and finally the maven, who was sure the flag had 56 stars on it in honor of the 56 states, won. And so when the first American tanks lumbered through the gates of the camp, they were greeted by cheering Jews who presented them with a flag in honor of their liberation with 13 stripes and 56 stars. Colonel Richard Siebel was the officer in command of the tank corps that entered Mauthausen that day. He accepted the flag graciously when it was presented to him as a gift on behalf of the prisoners at Mauthausen. And he was too wise a man to quibble or correct the Jews who had worked so hard to make this flag. He simply took it from them and said thank you, and then he did more than that. He had the Nazi flag lowered and thrown away, and he put his flag with its 13 stripes and 56 stars over the administration building. As long as he was in charge of that camp, that was the flag that flew there. When Colonel Siebel was reassigned some time later, he took this flag with him. He considered it a gift and a legacy and a precious souvenir. Colonel Siebel kept his flag on display in his home for many years. When he died, this flag went to his son. And then when the Simon Wiesenthal Center was built in Los Angeles, the son donated the flag to the center. He did so because he learned that one of the people who were liberated that day from Mauthausen was a man named Simon Wiesenthal. In 1991, the Simon Wiesenthal Center held a banquet to honor President George H.W. Bush for what he had done on behalf of the Jews of Ethiopia. President Bush had arranged for a 24-hour ceasefire during the civil war there so that the Israeli Air Force could fly back and forth and pick up as many Ethiopian Jews as possible. It was called Operation Solomon. And 15,000 Jews were rescued that day. And the son of Colonel Richard Siebel came marching in, carrying that flag with 13 stripes and 56 stars, and presented it to the President of the United States as a gift from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. What's the lesson in this story? When the Jews crawled out of the hell they called Mauthausen, what did they do? They didn't get revenge on their tormentors. They said thank you to the American army for having rescued them and for having saved the civilized world from the Nazis. What should we take away from this? Perhaps when we face difficult times, and God forbid it should be as difficult that they faced as Mauthausen inmates, we should dwell not on the horrors of what happened to us, for if we do that, it will only spoil us and sicken us. Instead, we should focus on the need to be grateful that our calamity has ended or is in the process of ending, and that there were those who cared about us and prayed for us, and that we are now near the time of beginning a life anew. A new life, a new beginning, a new start. Let's be inspired from this story to be grateful for what we have, even when life seems so hard, and to be hopeful that God will always be with us and support us. That even in the ashes of death, through all the evil that men do, through all the twisted barbed wire and war machines, God never forsakes us, never leaves us. He was always there. And as we recall the fire which consumed Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, we also remember the 6 million Jews and also the millions of others who perished in the sea of bullets, gas, and fires of the Holocaust under the Nazi regime. And so we say, never again, never again. Nadab and Abihu played with fire and they got burned. It was a tragic, horrible lesson. The Bible says that God is a consuming fire. He is not to be played with, nor his word. Yeshua is the word. Let's keep him and not try to change him for our own agendas. Let's honor him. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So as I close, I say this to everyone. May God's peace and protection be with you, be with all of you, in Yeshua's name, and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.